Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasutsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Mudake Dato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulabam Mudna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Namah Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambujo Radha Madana Mohano Kuladi Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Bandhan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhakta Maj Jai Rachilo Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galai Shila Tahate Na Hoilo Morachita Jeba Nahi Bhuji Keba Shunite Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Caitanya-carit Krishna upajibe priti janibe raserariti shuni le borohit Shruyatam shruyatam nityam giyatam giyatam mura Chintyatam chintyatam bhaktas Caitanya-caritamrta. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojanavatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, a graceful swan in the inexhaustible reservoir of Chaitanya Lila, wherefrom the very essence of Krishna Lila streams in the 10 directions, Shri Krishna Das Kaviraja Goswami Pad. Again, today we will absorb ourselves in Sri Caitanya-caritamrta, and we will resume our discussion of the Sanatana Shiksha, Madhya Lila chapter 22, the section on the Abhideya Tattva. And in our last discussion, we covered the aspect of how a jiva enters the path of bhakti, which is the principal abhideya of the Shastra, as per the siddhanta discussed earlier in this chapter, when that jiva comes to have association with a sadhu, and so also when, by virtue of that association with a sadhu, Krishna bestows his grace upon such a jiva, by coming into that jiva's life, if you will, in the form of a guru or an acharya who teaches the Shastra, and in a form within the vrittis of the citta, which gives rise to appropriate understanding of that teaching of the Shastra that was learned from the guru, and ultimately vrittis in the citta that lead to anubhav, or direct perception of himself. So this tremendous help, or this tremendous favor that Krishna shows to jivas by revealing himself or bestowing experience of himself upon jivas in these two forms, or by means of these two forms, is so profound that the great seers feel that they cannot become acquitted of their debt to Bhagavan for this, even if they do bhajan to him to the end of time. So we read this statement of Uddhava in our last reading, when we discussed the commentaries on this verse of Sridhara Swami, Jiva Gosvami and Visvanatha Cakravarti. So now we'll move to the following payar, which continues the topic of sadhu sangha. So that verse was cited to show how Krishna's grace flows in the wake of the sadhu's grace, and how the foremost of sadhus, or the best of bhaktas, the guru, is also conceived to be a form or an agent of Krishna in the deliverance of the jiva. So, now we'll move more to the psychological dynamics of how that takes place, or namely how the jiva whose psyche is filled only with the impressions created by experience of the objects of the senses, or what is loosely called vishay, how then the conviction and ultimately the bhakti to Krishna, whereby the bhakta becomes imbued with prem and fit for perception of Krishna, comes about, how these things colonize or download or become situated in the psyche. Now we'll enter more closer into the specifics of that, and that will develop in the ensuing discussion in the coming classes. So the file should be available in the box, and I will start from payar 149. So the tippani introduces this verse as follows. He describes the influence of sadhu sangha with 3 payars. So this and the following 3 payars, as well as the verses cited as evidence for them, are on this topic, the influence or the significance of sadhu sangha. So sadhu sangha Krishna bhakti shraddha jadi hoy, bhakti fal prem hoy, sangsara jai kshay. If shraddha in Krishna bhakti manifests as a result of sadhu sangha, then the fruit of bhakti, prema, manifests, and samsara reaches cessation. So this is the whole thing in a nutshell, so to speak. When someone gets sadhu sangha, they acquire shraddha. By the acquisition of that shraddha, they are able to take up the path of bhakti, or they engage in sadhana bhakti. As a result of that sadhana bhakti, they receive a manifestation of prema bhakti, and with the manifestation of prema bhakti comes the cessation of their samsara, or the cessation of their transmigration within material existence. So let's look a little bit at one important import of this statement. The word if, jadi, is stated in this payar to indicate that because sadhu sangha is the means by which a fortunate jiva can acquire shraddha in Krishna bhakti, there is the potential for a fortunate jiva to do so as a result of engaging in sadhu sangha. Yet, it is not guaranteed whether or not all fortunate jivas who do engage in sadhu sangha will actually acquire shraddha in Krishna bhakti. So it doesn't just say, once you have sadhu sangha, you get shraddha. It says, if shraddha in bhakti manifests as a result of sadhu sangha. So it's not guaranteed, but it's possible. Whether a particular jiva does or does not depends on a number of factors, such as the relative degree of purity of the jiva's psyche, that is, the relative degree to which they are free from the effects of offenses, and the relative degree of bhakti present in the heart of the sadhu with whom a jiva associates. Drop that with. And various other factors. So, someone's psyche may be heavily polluted, but they may come into the association of a highly exalted bhakta, whose association is so influential, even that thick degree of purification is relatively quickly purged. Or it may be that someone is relatively less polluted of mind, but doesn't acquire association of such great caliber, and therefore the process may take longer, whatever may be the destiny of an individual. So there's a potential, not a guarantee, and there's also a variety of outcomes in terms of efficiency or speed in the process. And that's, in a nutshell, the whole idea of adhikar, or one of the principal elements of that is the whole concept of adhikar, which is what we're entering into, or where the text is going now. If and when a fortunate jiva does acquire Shraddha in Krishna Bhakti, the relative speed at which that jiva will go on to attain Prema Bhakti, and thus incidentally transcend all entanglement in samsara, also depends on the relative purity of that jiva's psyche, the relative degree of bhakti present in the heart of the sadhu they associate with, and various other factors. The verse from Srimad Bhagavatam cited next to evidence the present payar discusses specifically the particular qualifications on the part of a sadhaka that lead to rapid success on the path of bhakti, that is, the attainment of prema bhakti. So we have this statement of Krishna to Uddhava from the 11th canto. Yadrichaya mutkotado jata shraddhas tuya puman na nirvino nati sakto bhakti yogasya siddhida. The practice of bhakti, of a person who is possessed of shraddha, in discussion and so forth, of me, independently, yet is neither disinterested nor excessively attached, is a grantor of success. So the bhakti yoga will prove successful, or will lead to the attainment, when the person has the appropriate eligibility, or is of high eligibility for the practice. So this verse specifies various elements of the eligibility, as well as how that fundamental eligibility is acquired. So this verse is quite significant, and there's extensive commentary and reference to it throughout the Goswami's works. So I think probably the rest of our class will go in discussion of this point. Sri Swamipad comments that, quote, independently, yadrichaya means by the arising somehow or another of good fortune. Kenapi bhagya udayina. So in other words, when it says a person possessed of shraddha in discussion of me independently, means they became possessed of that independently. But independent of what is not specified in the verse, or as we'll see, the word yadricha could perhaps more literally be rendered as of its own accord. So they became possessed of shraddha in this discussion of its own accord. So how was that, or what is the implication of this phrase, of its own accord, or independently? This is significant and something that our acaryas have discussed repeatedly. So we'll dive into this, as well as the other points listed here regarding the eligibility. So Sri Rupa Pad applies this comment of Sridhar Swami in his Karika in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu that defines the bearer of eligibility for the path of Uttama Bhakti, for which he cites the verse under discussion as the principal verse of evidence. So if we look at this Karika of Rupa Gosvami, it very closely follows the format of this verse. So he says, one who by some sort of great fortune is possessed of shraddha in his service, and is neither excessively attached nor possessed of non-attachment, is a bearer of eligibility for this, that is, for Uttama Bhakti, or technically he's speaking of Vaidhi Bhakti there, but through the analysis of the commentaries it's understood that it applies not only to Vaidhi Bhakti, but to Uttama Bhakti in general. Sri Jiva Pad, in his commentary on this Karika, defines, quote, Kenapiyati bhagyena, or some sort of great fortune, as a particular samskara produced by association and so forth with a mahat. So the and so forth would refer to service or relationship, etc., with a mahat, meaning a great bhakta. So this fortune, so to speak, is the production of a samskara, or in other words, a change in the state of the psyche. So what literally happens socially or externally is not what's being highlighted here. But how and to what extent the person acquires this samskara, that's the point. So in other words, what literal words the sadhu might have said, or what literal content of exchange might have happened, is variable. But what's significant is the psychological effect that it has. So what, where, and when will produce what psychological effect is a complex thing. In other words, the same statement made to different people can be interpreted in different ways, perceived or felt to be different according to cultural background and perception, etc., etc. So what's significant is when all these things combined produce the desirable effect. That's how the, kind of essential analysis of the matter takes place through, the lens of analysis of characteristics and so forth, according to this type of pedagogical methodology. So we can simply infer what might be a cultural expression of that based on whatever experience we have. In any case, the point is that when someone gets the association of a sadhu, when someone perceives the, persona, character, qualities, manner, etc., disposition of a great bhakta, then this produces some impression, this produces some samskara in them, which, in this case, the implication obviously is that it's a favorable samskara, or it's a samskara whereby one comes to treasure or comes to also value what they perceive to be essential to the character of the Mahat, namely bhakti. So a particular samskara produced by association with the Mahat is another way of saying a samskara for bhakti, or a samskara which gives rise to an inclination towards bhakti. So this is the fortune, or in other words, howsoever this one acquires this samskara, that's what's being referred to as the fortune. And the fortune is what is referred to by this word independently. In other words, well, it'll be explained further, so we'll come back to that. Sri Chakravarti Pad reiterates the same in his commentary on this karika, and then clarifies that, quote, non-attachment, vairagya, mentioned in the verse here, refers to useless non-attachment, or what is called falgu vairagya, that is unfavorable for bhakti, or worship, which Sri Rupa Pad later defines in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu as follows. The rejection of an object related to Hari by seekers of liberation based on consideration of its supposedly being mundane is called useless non-attachment. So the essential problem with such non-attachment is that it does not support a sadhaka on the path of bhakti, since it can lead to committing the offense to Bhagavan of disrespecting objects that have been offered to him and received as his prasad. So we heard about earlier regarding how bhakti without the support, jnana without the support of bhakti cannot produce liberation, and how even jivan muktas, following the path of jnana integrated with bhakti, can end up falling down if they then abandon the bhakti that helped them reach the state of jivan mukti. And as we saw repeatedly in the commentaries of Sri Jiva Pad and Sri Chakravarti Pad, this reference was made to a verse which says that if a jivan mukta doesn't follow along in a ratha yatra, when a vigraha of Bhagavan is moving by, in other words, when he thinks, I don't need to show respect to this deity of Bhagavan now that I've gotten the benefit that I required out of previously following bhakti, then as a result of that aparad, the psyche is again polluted, various vasanas for Vishaya return, and the person loses that state of being a jivan mukta. So similarly, if someone in the name of non-attachment shows disrespect to Bhagavan's prasad, this can also produce an aparad or an offense to Bhagavan. And thus, this quote-unquote non-attachment, which might be thought to be a spiritually beneficial thing because it's isolating one from further perpetuating one's vasanas for worldly enjoyment, is actually detrimental because it's creating a vasana, or it's creating the impression of an action which is actually disrespectful of Bhagavan and contrary to the spirit of bhakti. So vairagya, although sometimes conventionally thought of as a noble thing or a beneficial thing, can also be detrimental if it results in showing disrespect to prasadam, disrespect to deities, disrespect to various things related to Bhagavan. So, the verse under discussion says that one who's not disinterested, and in Rupapad's Karika he says that someone is not possessed of non-attachment, which would mean he's not detached. So you might think, does that mean we need to be attached? So then the verse is saying, not excessively attached. So he's not detached and he's not excessively attached. So where does that leave you? That leaves you attached, but only a little, right? Or not? So let's clarify that. First of all, Chakravarti says the following. Sri Chakravarti thus further clarifies that although such useless non-attachment is not part of the eligibility or adhikar for bhakti, it is not that all forms of non-attachment are excluded from the eligibility. He explains rather that, quote, one should certainly strive for the sake of non-attachment in regard to inclination towards the objects of the senses and the like. So he's saying that although this unfavorable type of vairagya should be avoided, still to foster some non-attachment towards further worldly enjoyment is also to be done. But then you might say, well, how much? Or in what manner? Or how does this apply to other things? So the following statement in the Sindhu is also very important in this respect. Be that as it may, it is principally, quote, taste or ruchi for bhakti that gives rise to detachment from objects of the senses. So later on, Rupa Gosvami says the following. For a person endowed with taste there in worship of Hari, even the heaviest attachment to objects of the senses largely dissolves. So here he's not saying that this quote-unquote dissolution of attachment comes about from trying to practice non-attachment. He's saying that from ruchi, from taste for bhajan, then even extreme attachment can be largely dissolved. So what does he mean by taste here? And this is important because the term taste is defined in multiple ways in the Sindhu. We've also already talked about two of them. One which Jiva Gosvami specified was the basis of the acquisition of Shraddha. If we remember earlier on, he described that its taste, or which he defined as a sense of excellence in an object, which in the case of such a sense of excellence in relation to bhakti gives rise to conviction or Shraddha in that object. So is he talking about that taste, which is fundamental to Shraddha? Or is he talking about the ruchi, which comes after nishta in the higher stages of sadhana? Which is that? So Chakravarti explains that neither, but rather here the word ruchi has yet another meaning. Sri Chakravarti also explains that the mention of taste in this verse refers to a particular degree or a Shraddha Vishesh, a particular variety of Shraddha, manifested after one's entrance into the path of bhakti. So once one has taken up the path, then, or in other words, the Shraddha that gives one the eligibility, as an outcome of that, there will be a taste or an appreciation for the thing. When you have conviction in it, that itself can be described as a sort of taste for it. And when one really has that conviction, then that itself will lead to the disintegration of attachment to other objects. So the main point here is the following. Thus, because the forward pull of one's taste for, that is Shraddha in bhakti, naturally gives rise to non-attachment to objects of the senses, being possessed of non-attachment is not integral to the eligibility for the path of bhakti. So why was it that here in the Bhagavatam and Rupa Goswami are saying that you don't need to be already non-attached? They're saying because if you just have conviction in this thing, even if you are attached, that conviction will pull you out of that attachment. So you don't need to acquire the conviction and acquire the non-attachment. If you just acquire the conviction, in the wake of that, the non-attachment will ensue from acting on or practicing, living out the conviction that you acquire from the sadhu, or in other words, the shraddha that you get in the sadhu, which is the whole payar that we're talking about now. Moreover, since even desire for enjoyment of the senses is not considered completely antithetical to bhakti, it is said that only not being excessively attached is integral to the eligibility for the path of bhakti. So this is another point that Chakravarti Pad makes in his Tika, that to become excessively averse to objects of enjoyment is actually unfavorable to bhakti. So, in other words, he even says in one point that to have kinchit, or some ruchi for objects of the senses, is no dosha, is not a fault, or it's not a problem in and of itself, provided that you do have the eligibility otherwise. In other words, if you have the fault of that attachment, but you don't have the conviction, you're not going to get anywhere. But if you do acquire the conviction, it's not such a problem if you still have some attachment to varieties of sense experience, because as you then act on that attachment, as it becomes more and more firm, then proportionately that detachment will ensue. So this is also a criterion for introspection. In other words, if in the wake of the shraddha you have in bhakti, there will be, for the most part, dissolution of even heavy types of attachment, then one can infer the relative depth of their shraddha by looking at the relative degree of detachment that they've acquired. So this then, as we know, and as will be explained ahead, one's level of eligibility is said to be proportionate to the firmness or the intensity of one's shraddha, which goes also to say the level of detachment that one has. So these are some related points. Now we'll look at the commentary of Jiva Gosvami on this Bhagavatam verse itself. So Jiva Pad further elaborates on how such eligibility is acquired in his commentary on the verse under discussion. So Shraddha alone is the cause in regard to eligibility for bhakti. Because of the supersedence, in the case of the path of bhakti, of the restrictions established in regard to birth and so on, in the case of the path of karma and so on, that is, and in the path of gyan. So in the path of gyan, you have to have vairagya. And in the path of karma, you have to have been born into a family in a certain varna, you have to have undergone certain samskaras, you have to have received certain types of education, and so forth. So he's saying that in the case of bhakti, there's a supersedence, or an overruling, if you will, of such rules that apply to the karma marg and the bhakti marg, and the jnana marg. So to specify that it's only shraddha that you need in order to be eligible for the path of bhakti, you may not have vairagya, you may not have birth in a high varna or a upanayan samskar or what have you, you're okay without them. Why? That's explained in this verse. Thus, Bhagavan Sri Krishna says, Yadrichaya, he speaks this verse. Quote, independently, Yadrichaya means by the arising somehow or other of the good fortune born of the association of a supremely independent bhakta of Bhagavan and such a bhakta's grace. As is stated in 1-16 of the Bhagavat, O learned ones, taste for discussion of Vasudeva shall come about for one possessed of Shraddha and desirous to hear such discussion, as a result of service to a Mahat, as an outcome of pilgrimage to a holy place. Since sadhus typically reside in holy places, when one visits a holy place, one has the chance of associating with sadhus, rendering service to them, and thereby receiving their grace and acquiring Shraddha and Krishna Bhakti. Because a jiva acquires Shraddha and Krishna Bhakti only by means of attaining the association and grace of a sadhu, that acquisition is said in the verse under discussion to occur, quote, independently. So now we get some more fine points here on the meaning of this cryptic word yadrichaya, which indicates, according to further explanation given elsewhere by Sri Chakravarti Pad, that it occurs independently of the jiva's karma. There's a typo. Meaning, it does not occur as a result of that jiva's karma, but rather independently of that. So if it's happening, quote, of its own accord or independently, then that implies it's not being influenced by, or it's not an outcome of something that would conventionally be thought to be the cause. So here Chakravarti Pad supplies the implied convention that's being contravened by the usage of the term, or that's being shown to be contravened by the usage of the term. So typically, whatever happens in the life of a jiva is an outcome of the jiva's karma. This is the universal rule. But the acquisition of sadhu sangha, or the samskar that you get from sadhu sangha, doesn't happen because of your karma. It's not that you earned that samskar by doing karma. Rather, you got it because you got the association of a sadhu, because a sadhu blessed you. That sadhu didn't bless you because of your karma. So therefore, it happened independent of your karma. It happened of its own accord. So we'll go into further explanation. In his commentary on the verse under discussion specifically, Sri Chakravarti Pad also refers to an explanation of the meaning, quote, independently, which he gives earlier in his commentary on the 4th canto of the Bhagavatam. So this verse also comes elsewhere, and he gives discussion as follows, quote, independently, as per the reasoning explained in the 1st canto, indicates that a person possessed of Shraddha in discussion and so forth of me, by means of independent association with a mahat, that is, by means of association with a sadhu. So here he describes this association with an adjective. We have this adverb, of it happening independently, and now we're being told that this, as an adjective, this can qualify that association. This association is, quote, independent. So far, that's compatible with the earlier explanation, that association is not a product of your karma, rather it's coming to you from some other reason. It's coming to you from a cause that's not your past karma. So someone might not be satisfied with the explanation so far and say, okay, if it's independent of my karma, then what is it? What is the thing that's actually causing me to get this association, if it's not my past karma, which is the cause of everything else that happens to me? So, for the especially inquisitive, we'll look further at how Chakravarti Pad elaborates on this. So this is in the 1st canto Tika. He raises a question. Well, also as per the statement of Sri Bhagavan, quote, while existing in this world, one who is situated in one's own dharma, sinless and pure, attains pure jnana, or bhakti to me, independently. Desireless karma yoga alone is the cause of bhakti. So how is bhakti said to be causeless? So this is the topic that he's explaining in that other tika, which is not directly the topic that we're on here, but in the course of answering this question, he explains a different meaning of the word yadrichaya, which answers the subject matter or the question that we're raising regarding the verse we're on. But in that context, there's this statement which says that if someone follows their dharma, if someone's free from sin, if someone's pure, then they can achieve bhakti independently. Or this word independently is also put there. But the implication then is that you would get this as a result of doing karma yoga, because that's what your dharma is, and becoming sinless and pure is the effect of following that dharma. So it would appear then that you would need to follow the path of karma yoga, and specifically nishkam karma yoga, in order to acquire this bhakti. So it would seem then that following the path of karma is the cause of entering the path of bhakti, which would mean that karma is the cause of bhakti. But in verse 126, bhakti is said to be ahoituki, or causeless. So if it's causeless, then how can karma be its cause? This is the tension, if you will, that's raised. So it's resolved as follows. In response, it should be said, true. Or, that's, what is it called? Abhyugamavad, I think it is, where you tentatively accept the premise of what the other person says in order for the sake of revealing a further subtlety which shows that that's not actually quite the accurate idea. So he says, true, desireless karma yoga can be considered a cause of bhakti to some extent. But, in that regard, it is not possible to declare karma yoga as being the cause of bhakti on its own. That is, desireless karma yoga is not on its own a cause of bhakti, as in the case of its being a cause of gyan on its own, because of the mention of the word independently inside the verse. That is, the mention of the word yadrichaya, independently, precludes the conclusion that karma yoga can be considered an outright, independent, and complete cause of bhakti. Furthermore, in this regard, if bhakti's independence, or yadricha, that is, self-will, now here's the interesting bit, is this word yadrich, which can be taken to mean of its own accord, he's now rendering this as svairita, or self-will. So this is where he goes with it in order to resolve the point philosophically. If bhakti's independence, that is, self-will, shall occur in relation to a person, that is, if pure bhakti's entrance into a person shall occur entirely without dependence on anything else, that is, any form of sadhana, such as karma or gyan, as a result of destiny, that is, as a result of the inscrutable unfolding of existence, means if it just somehow happens, then one attains that, meaning bhakti too. This is the meaning in this regard. Because, quote, independence means self-will, or svairita, or, oops, do I have a typo here? I think I do. That means an I. Svairita. According to the dictionary, in the case of any alternate interpretation by means of formulating some troublesome interpretation, bhakti's being self-manifest will not be established. So, still, I can at least say for myself, I'm not fully satisfied with this explanation, because he ultimately just says it's daiva, or it's just destiny that it comes about, it came of its own accord, it's like something that is as though self-willed. But how is that? Why is that? It's not quite crisp. He's still leaving it a little loose. But Chakravarti Pad is no slouch, if I dare say so. So he's got more on this elsewhere, don't worry. But to appreciate that, I'll just add a few notes. As per the aforecited explanations, a person acquiring Shraddha and Krishna Bhakti, quote, independently, should be understood to mean that a jiva acquires this not as a result of their own karma, but rather as a result of association with bhaktas of Krishna, whose association is attained independently of one's past karma, because it is attained as a result of those sadhus offering their association to a jiva out of grace upon that jiva, and such grace is inspired within the hearts of sadhus by bhakti itself. In this way, bhakti is self-manifest on account of its, quote, self-will, or independence, and thus it is said to be causeless. Sri Chakravarti Pad discusses this point further elsewhere. So this is the siddhanta. He says, or he answers the question, how is it that how does bhakti's causelessness come to be? To this it is said that the causelessness of bhakti is verily established because of Bhagavan's grace being contained in a bhakta's grace, which is a topic we discussed earlier. Because of a bhakta's grace being contained in association with a bhakta, in other words, if you get the chance to be in the association of a bhakta, it's because he's letting you do so. He's giving you that grace. So it's his grace that he allows such association. But then you may say, well, why is he being gracious? So number 3, because of association with the bhaktas being... Oh no, sorry, that comes later. And number 3 is that association with the bhaktas being a limb of bhakti. So sadhu sangha is also itself an act of bhakti. Bhakti's causelessness is established because of bhakti's being its own cause, since bhakti is acquired by means of associating with bhaktas, and the act of associating with bhaktas is a limb of bhakti itself. Moreover, the cause of a bhakta's grace, which is what enables such an act of association to occur, is the bhakti residing in the heart of the bhakta, because of the non-existence of the possibility of grace arising in a bhakta's heart without that. Meaning, without the bhakti present in the heart of a bhakta inspiring the bhakta to bestow grace upon someone. Therefore, indeed, in all respects, the cause of bhakti is bhakti alone, thus bhakti's causelessness is established. So bhakti is its own cause because it lives in the heart of bhaktas, and it inspires bhaktas to give sangha, or give association, or the chance for others to engage in association. And then when they do so, that person is thus engaging in an act of bhakti, and by thus engaging in an act of bhakti, they acquire, guess what? A samskara for bhakti, a samskara for the very act that they're performing, which is the natural outcome of any action. And thus, they acquire this samskara, or they acquire this, what Jiva Gosvami called, or defined as this great fortune of the samskara produced by association with a mahat, or a bhakta. So it's bhakti, which is independently, or of its own accord, inspiring a bhakta to give association, which enables a person to perform the act of bhakti of associating with a bhakta, which then creates the samskara for bhakti in the mind of the bhakta. And by that, they thus acquire a samskara for something which is not a product of karma, because they're not acquiring that association or performing that act of association principally as an outcome of any of their past actions, but rather principally because the grace of that bhakta inspired by that bhakta's bhakti is enabling it to happen. So therefore it is independent, or it's of its own accord, coming to the person. And therefore Rupa Gosvami, based on Sridhara Swami, are calling this, as per the Bhagavatam, a great fortune, or a fortune arising somehow or another, or in a way that's difficult to understand. In other words, how and when does the wish to bestow grace arise in someone's heart, and how it doesn't necessarily do so in all cases, but does so in some. This is the daiva aspect, or how things have an ultimately unpredictable or not fully quantifiable nature. So, hopefully, with all this analysis, we get some understanding of why in the verse under discussion originally that we're talking about, it mentions that the person acquires shraddha in discussion of Bhagavan, quote, independently. So, that's, maybe excessive detail, but for those who like detail, I hope they're satisfied. And now, there's one additional thing, is a little bit of a discussion returning to the other points in the verse about non-attachment and excessive attachment. So Chakravarti Pad, he elaborates also on this in his verse specifically, his commentary specifically on this verse in the Bhagavatam. So he says the following: ones, that is a bear of eligibility for bhakti's distinction from gyanis and karmis, and being of little prevalence, that is being rare, is indicated by the use of the singular number. So in the verse, it just says that someone who has shraddha and is not attached, their bhakti yoga can bestow success. But it doesn't say, it uses a singular, it doesn't use a plural. It doesn't say, those people who have this adhikar, it just says one. So he's saying that choice of speaking in the singular should be understood to imply that such adhikaris, or people who have eligibility for bhakti, are very rare. Then, quote, not excessively attached, nati saktaha, means free from excessive attachment to one's body, house, wife, and so on. In regard to the mention of, quote, not disinterested here, in the case of one's being disinterested in those, meaning body, house, wife, etc., there is eligibility for the path of gyan. And in the path of one's being excessively attached to them, there is eligibility for the path of karma. In the absence of excessive attachment, there is eligibility for the path of bhakti. In this way, there is discernment of three eligibilities, those for karma, gyan, and bhakti, respectively. the cause of so then you might say, okay, now what's the cause of the cause? Or somebody is not excessively attached, someone else is detached, how did they become like that? So he explains, the cause of disinterest is only purity of the psyche, or antakarana shuddhi, caused by performance of desireless karma. So the only way someone acquires this disinterest in or non-attachment to objects of the senses or principal common objects of attachment is by having performed nishkam karma, or desireless actions as enjoined in the Shastra, and thereby purifying the psyche of those vasanas for those things. So then the other side of the coin is, well, what about these people who have this excessive attachment and who these persons qualified for the path of Gyan who used to have that attachment and now removed it by doing nishkam karma? Where did they get that? He says the cause of excessive attachment is only beginningless ignorance. So anadya vidya, in other words, the basic, fundamental condition of the jiva is to be riveted to the state in which they're in, or to be thoroughly attached to the world in which they exist. And this is the beginningless condition. So from that beginningless condition, if some have done nishkam karma, they may be detached from these things and eligible for Gyan, and some may not have such purity of the psyche, may not have done such nishkam karma, and simply be excessively attached. But how is it that someone can get not excessively attached, but yet not also have this vairagya either? So he says, the cause of being free from excessive attachment is only independent association with a mahat. In other words, it's only by sadhu sangha that you can acquire taste, as it was explained earlier, for something that is greater than these worldly pleasures, superior in nature to them, more fulfilling in nature to them, and thereby no longer be excessively attached to these things without at the same time necessarily having acquired specifically detachment from them. So in this way, the causes in regard to each path are observable. Moreover, this aforementioned characteristic of a bearer of eligibility for the path of bhakti is the characteristic only of an advanced bearer of eligibility. In other words, how much someone may have shraddha, how much someone may be free from excessive attachment, maybe little, maybe more. But he's giving a broader point and saying the following. Whereas, indeed, anyone possessed of senses, in other words, any human being who has had independent association with the bhakta, is to be known as a bearer of eligibility for the path of bhakti. So in other words, even if you're excessively attached to these things, or even if you're, highly detached and you're a serious jnani, in either case, if you get this mahat sangha, you become qualified for bhakti to some extent, or at least enough to say that you have some degree of eligibility, at least a little. So this is described in the Bhagavatam in the following verse. Quote, O king, indeed, who possessed of senses and subject to death from every quarter would not worship the lotus feet of Mukunda, which are the object of worship even for the foremost of the immortals. So, Rupa Gosvami also makes this point in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu a little bit differently, but he also includes this point of discussion that, broadly speaking, anyone is potentially eligible for bhakti. So he says the following. Quote, the eligibility of every human being for bhakti is heard of in the Shastra, since bhakti to Hari was adduced as an example by Vasishta while speaking to a king of the eligibility of all for bathing during the month of Magh, as is seen in the Padma Puran. Quote, indeed everyone is a bearer of eligibility in this case, that is, in the case of bathing during the month of Magh, as in the case of bhakti to Hari, O king. So, the point here is not necessarily to talk about bathing in the month of Magh. He's just giving an evidence to say that something that everyone is eligible for, then by comparing that to bhakti of Hari, the implication is that everyone is also potentially eligible for that, or has fundamental eligibility for it. So Jiva Gosvami clarifies that Rupa Gosvami makes this point because after this whole talk of Shraddha and non-attachment or non-excessive attachment and all this comes up, still people who are part of the society in which these texts were written may also wonder, well, does that mean you have to be part of the three upper varnas, the Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas, to culture this, the same way that you can only culture the Vedas if you're part of these three upper varnas? Is it like that, or is it something that even Shudras or even outcasts can also participate in? So Jiva Goswami premises Rupa Goswami's statement here like this to indicate that he's saying that it doesn't have anything to do with your varna or ashram or jati or what have you. Just being a human being is sufficient. In other words, if you're a human being and you get sadhu sangha, that's the beginning of your eligibility. And the more that samskara created by that sadhu sangha deepens, the more you'll have shraddha, the more you'll have taste, and thus the less you'll be attached to the mundane, and the more you'll become eligible and free from the obstacles to advancement on the path. So in this way, the eligibility or the effect of sadhu sangha is explained, or rather, Shraddha in Krishna Bhakti is acquired as a result of sadhu sangha. So the whole premise of the discussion is to stress the effect of sadhu sangha by saying whoever you are, whatever your condition you're in, if you somehow get sadhu sangha, that's the beginning of your eligibility or your adhikar for the path of bhakti, no matter whether you're an outcast, no matter whether you're completely attached to mundanity or what have you. Sadhu sangha has such potential, and the necessity of it is so great that nothing else makes you eligible except that sangha. In other words, even if you're highly qualified for the karma marg or the bhakti marg, that still doesn't make you qualified for bhakti. It's only sadhu sangha. So I'll stop here for today. This is the point of analysis. So in the coming discussion, we get further import and analysis of the value and the effects of sadhu sangha. And then we go further into the details of this shraddha, or of this samskar created by that sadhu sangha, which makes one eligible for the path of bhakti. So then we look at what is that fundamental conviction, and then what are the different characteristics of its relative degrees of firmness or intensity. So that's where the discussion unfolds ahead. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or anything otherwise, please feel free to share.
Maharaj?
Yes.
Are we going to talk about the qualification of that sadhu sangha? I mean, the qualification of that sadhu, will that make a difference, how qualified the particular sadhu is that gives his association?
It will make a difference. And we will discuss that. So, in the verses ahead, those points will come.
Stay tuned.
Yes. Another hand.
Yes. Pranam Shri Krishna Dasa. I have a question related to Payar 49.
Okay.
And in particular, the relation between prema and the cessation of samsara. So
Okay.
in I don't think it was in a class, but like a number of years ago, just in some casual discussion with some bhaktas, I remember hearing that prema does not always immediately lead to moksha. So like, if someone's a sadhaka bhakta for several lifetimes, and then in one particular lifetime, they do attain prema, in some cases after their next death, they will get moksha, but in other cases, they may continue to take birth. Now, they won't be in samsara in the usual sense, but they may continue to have a semblance of taking birth for some number of lifetimes, either large or small, and that the person who's attained prema doesn't really have a preference, right? Like, they leave it up to Bhagavan. If Bhagavan wants them to attain moksha right away, they'll attain moksha, but otherwise they'll continue in samsara. So I was wondering, is Payar 49 saying something different? Is Payar 49 saying that moksha always occurs shortly after the attainment of prema, or are the two things compatible?
I think your summary of what you heard from whoever you heard it from was good. and was a nice description of how we understand things. And as far as this payar, I wouldn't read it in tension with that, but as a loose overview. In other words, when someone achieves prema, then they're being subject to, or you could say entangled in or bound in samsara. That is no longer there because there's nothing that needs or perpetuates them being in samsara as such. But whether or not they'll immediately or a little later, cease to be in samsara will depend on the specific of what they spiritually aspire to and how Bhagavan so wills to bestow it upon them. So we see all different cases in the Bhagavatam, and we hear different trajectories, so to speak, that jivas pursuing different types of attainment. In other words, to achieve Vaikuntha can happen more immediately. To enter into Gokula or to enter into the domain of Braj, it's not so easy, or may require some further births to acquire association with Brajabasis. So there are different, ways it can play out. But here, and in many cases in these type of statements in the Caritamrta, they're not meant to be read entirely literally, but they're meant to be understood as kind of soft brushstrokes, if you will, of how things unfold. And then inside that, there's all this nitty-gritty that you get in, the text like we're reading today, where, when you get Shraddha from Sadhusanga, then you get Prema, and then you're free from Samsara. Oh! Like, if you were to read it completely literally, it would be quite an oversimplification, wouldn't it? But obviously it's not a mere oversimplification. It's just, like introducing the thing at different degrees of detail so that people can, when they enter into further subtleties, can kind of easily understand where they are on the grid or where they are in the overall set of stages in the process. So simplifications as well as detailed analysis both have their utility and are ideally studied together.
Then a follow-up question: would we then make a distinction between the cessation of samsara and moksha, in that someone could, apparently be going through samsara, like someone who's attained prema could apparently be going through samsara. I'm phrasing this wrong. Someone who's attained prema but not yet moksha isn't really in samsara. I mean, they have a body and they look like they're in samsara, but like psychologically they're not in samsara. So is that kind of what this verse is getting at? Or is the verse more getting at the idea that prema inevitably leads to moksha sooner or later? Kind of which should we take, or maybe both, as the kind of main meaning of this part of the verse?
Well, as we've discussed earlier in the chapter, there's what's known as Jivan Mukti. So the word moksha or mukti is loose, right? And there's multiple concepts of mukti. There's a type of mukti that exists while one is embodied and, so to speak, within samsara, and there's another category of mukti where one is not. So if we equate this samsara ceases with moksha, then we could equate it with jivan mukti, we could equate it with atyanta mukti. And in many of the cases, when these statements are made like this in the Caritamrta, they're made in a way that can cover the whole category or it can cover all the subcategories that fit under it. So, when prema manifests, then to say that samsara ceases can mean that someone's a jivan mukti. It can mean that inevitably, as an ancillary effect of that prema, they'll eventually attain atyanta mukti. Both applications are applicable, and in this case, reading in the context of the verse and the intent of the author, it's not essential to specify that, because the primary purpose of the payar is to emphasize the effect of sadhusanga in bringing about this chain of events. And as far as what exactly is the cessation of samsara, what exactly is the ultimate attainment, that's something that gets further specified elsewhere. So because it's not the primary tatparya of the prakaran, then the degree of detail that we've gone into about, the other parts of this verse, is proportionately different because, at least the way I do commentary is it's, what you call tippani, or it's focused primarily on the intent of what's being conveyed in the prakaran of the text. And when you, at least for me, when you then look at the potential way that pertinent phrases in the verse could be interpreted within the whole scope of the theology, it becomes like impossible to finish a commentary on any sentence, because if you explain this, then you have to explain all the categories of moksha, then you have to explain how, then you have to write a book on, I don't mean to be excessive, but, it becomes like extremely elaborate. So at least for me, I very much have to apply conceptual parameters to the discussion to prevent excessive elaboration. So at least in the style that I write, I use what they call tippani as a strong guideline, if you will. So that's why I haven't elaborated on in this context. But you could do so, and as you get from elsewhere in the text, what the potential meanings will be.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure one day, once I've studied this body of literature more, I'll be able to kind of implicitly remind myself of the less significant things related to each verse, because I'll already know it. But I'm still kind of trying to wrap my head around it. Thank you.
Sure. All right, well, let's close here for today. And if we're so blessed, we'll continue with further discussion of the Mahatmya, or the greatness and benefit of Sadhu Sangha, in the coming discussion next week. Jai Shri Radhe Vaishnavebhyo Namo Nama. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam. I stop here.